Winter, and special thanks to you, Jan, for joining us once again in this series. We began this series a couple of years ago in an effort really to open people's eyes to something most of us never anticipated we would have to talk about, namely the resurgence of anti-Semitism in our own day. Jan, I know you're sitting in Warsaw and have been in Poland for quite a while, and you'll be talking with our viewers, lots of them, by the way, looking in on you today, about the situation in the country where you grew up and have devoted so much time to studying. Among scholars today who are persistent and extremely knowledgeable in studying Poland, both in the wartime period of World War II and in post-war, present-day Poland, few stand out with the prominence, insights, and contributions of Jan Grabowski. So Jan, it's really a great privilege to have you with us again. Professor Grabowski's book, Hunt for the Jews, Betrayal and Murder in German-occupied Poland, came out with Indiana University Press some years ago, and it was extremely well received, winning the Yad Vashem International Book Prize for 2014. When I say more recently, I mean this very week. Indiana University Press, in its series Studies in Anti-Semitism, has just published the book that Günther referred to. Günther, would you hold that up once again? I don't have my copy with me. There it is, which we strongly recommend, Night Without Ends, The Fate of Jews in German-Occupied Poland. Jan Grabowski has devoted years to studying this material. He continues to take a good, hard, scholarly look at it, and he will be speaking to us in just a moment about some of the results of his research and Barbara Engelking's in doing this book together. Jan, it's my pleasure now to turn over to you. We very much look forward to learning from you. We always do, and we'll have time for discussion after your presentation.
Alvin, thank you so much for this most kind introduction, and most of all for the invitation to this prestigious venue. Thank you, Günther. Thank you, Alvin. And I try not to be, let's say, not to flood you with unnecessary details, but once again, I am very grateful for this opportunity. So without further ado, let me jump into the center of the issue. So as Alvin mentioned, the topic of my talk is the book that you see in front of me, Night Without End. It is a book in Latin. We have a proverb, habent sua fata libelli, which means that books have their own fates. And before I introduce you to the content of this book, I would like to tell you, those of you who are not familiar with the story, just few words about the background of this book. Its fate, basically, because the book comes with a very heavy load of own bookish experience, which makes it a fairly also unique publication due to circumstances in which it has lived. Books, of course, live, and this one had a very hard and difficult life so far. So let's hope that its English edition will sail through less turbulent waters than the original Polish edition did. So first of all, the book that you can, and I hope will purchase for your pleasure and delight, is a not translation, but it's a version of, a bit abridged version of 2-volume study, A Night Without End, Dalej Noc, which has been published in Poland in the spring of 2018. Now, the reason I'm mentioning this fact is that timing was actually very important. And now, first of all, this is not a book which is written by one or two people. It is a collective work, effort of 8 scholars who worked over years, 5 to 6 years, and conducted regional studies that I will discuss with you in a moment, a sort of publication that people would flee away from, rich in facts, in detail, very academic, very scholarly, I would say, with loads of footnotes. Once again, in American edition is slightly, I would say, improved over the Polish one, but in any case, not something that would become an overnight sensation, definitely not. Now, however, publishing by a group of independent scholars in Poland, Anno Domini 2018, in the spring, a book which takes a hard critical look at the fate of the Jews in Poland under the occupation, at their relations with the mainstream Christian society, so to say, triggered in Poland nothing short of a tsunami. Because as you remember, in the winter of 2018, the Polish nationalistic authorities, in their wisdom, introduced a new law, which we refer to in the West as the Polish Holocaust law, which threatened independent scholars of the Holocaust with, and let's say, people who would reject the official authorities approved historical narrative with prison terms up to 3 years. So in these circumstances, putting this book on the table, a book which was full of scholarly research, but as you will see, some by all means not all conclusions pointed to the fact of certain collusion of mainstream society or participation of segments of Polish society with the German genocidal plan. All of this created an absolute outrage on the part of Polish authorities. And I might here be justified in saying that never in Polish historiography, a book, academic book in history, has triggered such a hunt, I would call it, in a wave of misinformation, slander, again directed against the scholars who took part in this effort. One of my favorite Polish politicians, he is now the Minister of Education of all things, described our book as, I quote, anti-Polish Nazi rag, end quote. But the Minister of Justice actually expressed himself in a very similar way. Now, you might have heard that 2 of the editors of the book, myself included, we were, let's say, we spent our time in court being targeted by civil proceedings directed against us by a well-funded by the Polish state organization. In the end, this lawsuit, which lasted for 2 years, ended on appeal. The case has been dismissed. We were completely vindicated. And then, lo and behold, the Polish Minister of Justice, I quote from his social media statement, said that the authors of the book Night Without End are academics, so they can lie with impunity. The verdict is not only an embarrassment for the court, but also a judicial assault on the idea of justice, end quote. So this gives you an idea what kind of language is being used in Poland against critical historians, independent historians, who are not working under the government, let's say, approved guidelines. So what you see is a climate in which our book had to thrive, so to say, was not very hospitable. It was as a hostile climate as you can possibly imagine, and this hostility is long-lasting. So this is something still ongoing, and the chilling, the freezing effect of this this hunt, so to say, officially inspired and forced hunt, has spilled around, and today you can feel it in the Polish academia, especially among younger scholars, among people in smaller academic centers. Now, before I start to give you an overview, I would like just to introduce you to the authors of this study, and in the English version we are 8, and just very briefly, Anna Zapalec, who wrote a fascinating chapter on the history of fates of Jews of Złoczów, which is in the eastern part, actually in district Galicia, in the east of General Gouvernement. So Anna Zapalec from Pedagogical University of Kraków, Dagmara Swałtek-Niwińska. Some of my authors, so to say, are with us today. So Dagmara Swałtek-Niwińska of Polish Academy of Sciences, who looked at Bochnia County, very close to Kraków. Tom Friedel, University of Toronto, who conducted research into the fates of Jews of Dębica, southeastern part of Poland. Jean-Charles Chourek, Université Paris-Nanterre, who looked at Łuków County, southeast of Warsaw. Alina Skabinska from the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, looked at Biłgoraj, a remote area close to Lublin. Barbara Engelking, my co-editor, Polish Academy of Sciences, who looked at Bielsk-Podlaski County during the war in Becirk Białystok, and Karolina Pans, Polish Academy of Sciences, who studied a fascinating piece of borderlands close to the Slovak border. So you have basically a collection here of chapters. However, it is not these chapters have been written according to very stable and very, let's say, I would say, well-applied methodological frame that I will show to you in a moment. So at this stage, I would like simply to take this opportunity to thank all these co-authors who made this book, especially those younger scholars who are now in Poland and who had the resilience and courage to face the hostile and aggressive Polish state. So now, this having been said, moving on a more general level, as you know, most of you know that Holocaust has become a popular topic fairly late. In other words, the interest in the Holocaust became, we can say, universal only in the 1990s, so fairly recently, long after the event. It, of course, became this universal benchmark of human evil. Now, I am not here I don't have even the time to start delve into why, but it remains true that one of the very few events in human history which triggers some kind of recollection or some kind of reaction. Words like Auschwitz will resonate practically regardless of whether you are on one continent or another one. And due to the Holocaust becoming this benchmark of evil, different people, states, institutions, governments want to position themselves with regard to that particular event, which explains, of course, in part the nervous attitudes and nervous reactions of the Polish nationalistic officials. Now, in my work as a historian and organizing conferences, researching and reading about the event, I have seen over the last several years and a trend in world Holocaust historiography, and this is a trend away from the event itself and more to something we call Holocaust memorial studies, commemoration studies, impact on survivors or impact on second generation. And I even was told that there are studies now on the impact of the Holocaust on a third generation. So these things tend perhaps not yet to dominate the field, but they indeed are at the core of what's very often being done. Now, this in turn implies that we already know enough about the event itself. And here I dare to disagree. So the book that is once again being brought to your attention today is a living proof that we do not know enough, and that there is such a lot of things to discover about this greatest catastrophe, or one of the greatest catastrophes in human history. So this book will try this overview of 8 counties in remote parts of Poland. That's what we did. Is a proof of how much still remains to be done, how much remains unknown, despite very good studies which have been conducted. So what you have here is a study, or are studies of fairly remote areas. We decided, for reasons of methodological unity here also, that we would focus rural areas with small shtetls, with small towns, in other words, in mostly southern and eastern Poland. Now, the reason is simple. We know much more about large urban centers and the ghettos associated with them. So many of you have heard, of course, about the Warsaw Ghetto, about the Łódź Ghetto, about Kraków Ghetto. But we need to remember that the Jewish experience was actually very much a provincial one. In other words, 75% of Poland's Jews did not live in large cities. They were concentrated in these shtetls, in small towns, often dispersed through the countryside. And this is where our focus will be. So we are paying attention to few cities, but they will be at the margin of our interest. There is ample literature about them. Now, also, what you will see is that the ghettos, in a vast majority, the ghettos we describe, they don't have walls. If they have any fences at all, they show up fairly late in the day, shortly before the ghettos will be liquidated. So the Jewish experience is not, as many of you think, it is not an experience of isolation behind the wall and barbed wire. It is a fairly open, still space, in terms of lack of physical obstacles. Nevertheless, they are very much also closed, these ghettos, for reasons of which you will find out once you start reading these studies. Now, a historian of the Holocaust in Poland, or we historians of the Holocaust in Poland, we usually divide the Holocaust in Poland into 3 stages. One is the early occupation and ghettoization, so 39 to early 42, and this is the hunger, the German regulations, the restrictions on Jewish mobility. So this is the initial period of time. It of course, in different areas, it starts later or sooner, depending on the area, but it ends with the opening of the second period, which is the liquidation actions and extermination. And this is a part where which we devoted extraordinary attention. I will develop this part in a short moment. Liquidation actions is something that I discovered to my utter horror as a historian many years ago. And one of the reasons I thought this project would be so important is to bring to you sometimes these few hours or few days during which the Jewish communities have been liquidated, to use the German word, or simply annihilated. So this is one part of our work. The other one is the post-liquidation. The third period is everything that happens once a vast majority of Polish Jews have been delivered to the death sites, such as Bełżec, Treblinka, Sobibór, or Auschwitz or Helm. So we look at this third period with equal attention. So now on these in these 8 counties that you will be asked to look at. you will find that we were, so to say, tracking 110,000 Jews. And it was who lived in these areas prior to liquidation actions, so prior to 1942. At the eve of Aktion Reinhardt, which the Germans called the action of simply extermination of Jewish people in Poland. What we found, usually it was between 5 and 10%. The Jews formed up to between 5 and 10% of the total population, which usually was majority Polish, but in two cases, it was in one case majority Ukrainian or majority Belarusian. So there is also an ethnic mix, especially in the East. Now, what we brought here to you is, I would say, profound drilling in terms of going after sources which are known to an extent to scholars in Poland, and which are very little known to Western audience. So I hope that if you dig your way into these texts, you will discover a world of sources which might be a surprise to you, sources which have not really been debated much in world Holocaust historiography. To give you an example, literally thousands of so-called 301 testimonies, which are absolutely unique sources. They are very short accounts given by Jewish survivors, usually between 1945, 46, and 47, right after the catastrophe, collected by the historians, surviving historians working in historical commissions established by Polish Jewry. So most of these things are dated to 45, 46, because as you know, after 46, not so many Jews are left in Poland. Now, these documents, very short documents, usually written in Polish or in Yiddish, they are of extraordinary value because they are so fresh, so contemporaneous practically to the events, and they have no ulterior motives. It's not the question of reparations, of any kind of legal grievances. It's just to document, look, they killed my town, my village, my family. So this is the Jewish memory, which we desperately want to preserve. And of course, the 1960s testimonies from Yad Vashem a bit later on, and then Spielberg, which is much foundation, which is much better known. German memory. We are trying to do this triangulation for each small part of a county that we study. We want to bring these three, let's say, sometimes very conflicted memories. So Jewish memory, German memory, which will be investigations from the 1960s, 1970s, some letters, not so many, investigations done by the Germans in West Germany into this is what Christ Browning did, for instance, in Reserve Battalion 101. And then you have the bystander memory. Now, bystander, I'm of course introducing the term here in quotation marks, because as you will see, to stand by when all your Jewish neighbors were slaughtered on the other side of the street that you dwelled, or across the park, or simply in front of your windows. So bystanding was extremely difficult proposition, if possible at all. So one of the things that you should, or I hope you will take away from the reading of this text, which is not easy, as you can already see, will be this question mark placed after the word bystander. Can we at all apply the term bystander, which has been coined by Raoul Hilberg all these many years ago? Does it apply? Well, if it's dubious, it applies in Western Europe. In Eastern Europe, can we use it at all? There are some new studies by Elżbieta Janicka, for instance, who proposed new kind of terms to replace the term bystander. But I'm not going into this. So we have here Polish memory, which we try here to bring to the fore, which is laborious work of many years in local archives, trying to go to the lowest rungs of local administration, which has been governed by the Germans but run by the Poles. So what the people who were closest to these Jews, how they reported, what was their role, underground press, of course, records of Polish resistance. All of this is brought to you in front of you, large, huge volume of evidence. And one of the most important parts, by far not the most important, but one of the most important ones, are the court proceedings, so-called August files, or the proceedings of Polish courts, regular Polish courts from 1947, 8, 9. And these proceedings were based on so-called August bill, which stipulated penalties for Polish citizens who somehow aided the Germans in their genocidal policies. And in thousands of cases, this help given by the Poles to Germans, as the judicial authority said, was making one's own contribution to the completion of the final solution of the Jewish question. In other words, blackmailing your Jewish neighbors, murdering them, denouncing them. So these things came to the attention of Polish courts, and they were, I would say, very reluctantly pursued. Why? Well, I call these cases orphaned cases, but they are hundreds of thousands of pages that we need to look at. Why orphaned? Because practically no one was interested in pursuing after the war, especially after 1946, the cases of Poles who harmed the Jews. Now, the Jews were gone. They were either dead or they fled Poland in vast majority after the July 1946 Kielce pogrom. So people who were left, and there were not so many, Jewish people who were left in Poland made a logical choice. If they stayed in Poland, then the last thing they wanted to do was to go and accuse their Polish neighbors of wrongdoings against them. So there were very few actually who did it, but the vast majority did not. So these are orphan trials because, of course, Polish courts did not want really to engage too much. Sometimes it were people who were heroes of local community, heroes of Polish resistance, who at the same time were vicious murderers of the Jews. Now, the communist authorities didn't want to do it as well for one simple reason. They already were considered Jewish lackey in popular parlance. So you didn't want to confirm this popular idea that you were a Jewish lackey by pursuing Poles who harmed the Jews. So all of these things are the records which we were looking at. Now, what were our, many more, of course, but we don't have the time. I don't want to, I want to make it boring. And the last thing you want to do is to listen to methodological issues. So what we found is that among these 110,000 Jews that came to the focus of our study, 1.5 to 1.6% survived, which is more or less, you have to understand the average in Poland. If you look at the overall, these statistics are not, of course, firm science. We suppose that from among 3 million Polish Jews who at one point found themselves under the Nazi boot, between 30 and 45,000 survived, which gives you about the same ratio. Imagine, it is 1.something%. So this is reflected in our own, well reflected in our own study. However, you see great local variations. It means, for instance, if you look at Złoczów, the easternmost part that Dr. Zapalec, Anna Zapalec was studying, you will see that that the rate of survival was 3 times higher than in the province, in the county that I studied, Węgrów, in the northeastern part, northeast of Warsaw. Now, why? Well, once again, you will have to read the book, but you will see that the variations, local variations, are important. Nevertheless, at the end of the day, very few Jews are left standing. They can reach their deaths in a variety of different ways, which we describe, but they will reach them. Their deaths, I mean. In Złotów, of course, the occupation is shorter, right? The Germans arrive in 1941, not in 39, and they are being pushed out by the Soviets already in the summer of 1944. And these last 7 months of war were very painful for the Jews. That's where the resources run out, and their Christian hosts run out of patience. So Jewish death became even more commonplace. So these variations which we study are included in this book. So furthermore, what we look here is 10% of Jews during the liquidation actions, brutal, horrifying affairs, which we describe in detail, go into hiding. And 70% of them either die at the hands of local Gentiles or are denounced by them to the Germans. And this is actually this one bit that created the whole explosion on the part of the authorities in Poland. But this is just one part of these findings, which are so many. Now, I mentioned to you that we were looking at this throughout these studies at Aktionen, or the liquidation actions. Now, you might have heard about Treblinka. You might have heard about the different death camps. Everything is true. You might have not heard that during these hours and days of utter horror, the Germans murdered in situ, in other words, inside the liquidated ghettos, between 10 or 20% of Jewish local population. That's what's being reflected through our study. You can see that this absolutely horrifying orgy of terror, of horror, was supposed to threaten, to frighten into complete, let's say, submission, the Jewish society, the Jews left inside. So in Węgrów, it was between 10 and 20% of people who were murdered in the shtetl, in the ghetto. In Nowy Targ, 20, in Złotów, between 36 and 38, and in Biłgoraj, in the east, close to Lublin, close to 50%, because there were no railway lines close to the ghettos. So the Germans found it more convenient to murder people inside, in situ. So all of these things were, perhaps they were known, but they were not publicized definitely. And this is something, so then we describe in a very much detail the circumstances, the German technique, the German forces used to it. And then looking at the local complicity, how the local society, local Gentiles, and how the local organizations, institutions, voluntary firefighters, Polish Blue Police, and simply people, neighbors, how they inserted, reacted, or did not insert themselves in German planning. So to cut the long story short, each and every county is very different. In Dębica, for instance, you can see that the Jews were, very many Jews were scattered in villages. They were avoiding being put in the ghetto for a long time, and this gave them an edge. Once they were not inside the ghetto, and then the role of little labor camps for Jews, something also very fascinating, places where Jews could actually survive for some time. This in Bochnia, due to a variety of reasons, the liquidation of the ghetto happened very, very late in the day, in September 1943, giving also an edge to the people who were here involved. And now finally, in the course of our work, and you will see it reflected in this writing, you will see that we came close to people whom we are writing about. It is also one of the joys of writing micro-history of the Holocaust, because people come to you, survivors, children of survivors. And on the other side, you also touch on the evil. You go after the documents of horrors, and you talk to people whose parents or grandparents did horrifying things. You look at bones that are being brought up from the ground, from long forgotten graves. And you also discover, as my colleague, Professor Jean-Charles Szurek did, the last Jew in Łuków on Aryan papers until very recently. So this is a process of, and the final thing that we did was, of course, firstly, was looking at the Jewish fates, at strategies of the Jews. What did they do to survive? And this is the crucial part of our work. And what we did was looking at trying to show how energetic, how full of initiative were the Jews in the studies counties. Extraordinary, absolutely extraordinary will to survive, to fight, ingenuousness. So smuggling, Jewish smuggling networks visible so well in Karolina Pance's work, in Dagmara's work, in the southern parts where you could smuggle yourself to try to smuggle yourself to Hungary, through Slovakia. And then you have the strategies of survival from labor camp to labor camp to labor camp, as long as there was a place where Jews were still entitled to live. Once there were no more places where Jews were entitled to live, you tried to go into hiding with Christians, horrifying propositions for some, but also a recipe for survival for many. So all of this is something that we look at. And then something that came so clear in the case of my county, Węgrów, is the proximity of Treblinka extermination camp, which was just across the border in the neighboring county, and the radius of evil camps or camp exuded or created. Possibilities of theft, of robbery, of people escaping from death trains being hunted down by the locals, trains leaving Treblinka with clothing of the dead, which were being targeted for robbery. You can see the zones of evil surrounding the large camps and small camps. And then you have the dilemmas of righteous, and I would go on and on and on. What I can only promise you is that this is a book which I hope will bring to life and to light new facts and open certain new avenues of research, which I hope will be taken or used. So now my time is nearly up. So in conclusion, so I hope that you will find this book worthy of your time, and you will not share the opinion of Minister of Education in Poland, for whom is an anti-Polish Nazi rag. And also it's not a book written by the enemies of the Polish nation, but simply a book written by people deeply preoccupied with the size and details of Jewish catastrophe in Poland. So I guess here I will thank you very much for your attention. I'm open to hear your questions. Thank you.